Welcome, dear friends, seekers of stories, lovers of words, and admirers of all the ways literature and cinema intertwine. I am so grateful you are here with me. You, who find joy in dissecting films as if they were novels. You who savor the idea that every shot, every line, every silence carries weight beyond the surface. Before we journey further, I'll ask gently, if you find comfort, curiosity, or inspiration in these explorations, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Not as a transaction, but as an act of shared passion, a way of building a circle where film and literature enthusiasts can return again and again, knowing they are among kindred spirits. I must be clear, though, this is not a traditional movie review. It is something softer, something stranger, and perhaps more rewarding. What follows is not a consumer's guide to whether or not to watch this film, but rather a deeply intellectual, theoretical, and critical analysis. It is designed for those who, like me, approach movies the way one approaches a complex text, with patience, with wonder, and with the willingness to be educated by what lies beneath the surface. The film we'll be exploring today is The Mummy, 1999, a piece of cinema that has lived in my imagination for years, not only as a pulpy action adventure, but as something that feels mythic, intimate, and strangely personal. From the very first time I encountered it, I felt as though I was stepping into a story that wanted to whisper to me about more than curses, sandstorms, or long-buried tombs. Yes, it is a story of archaeologists, soldiers, and pharaohs. Yes, it is dressed in spectacle, swirling sands, burning deserts, golden treasures. But beneath that spectacle, I sensed something older, something like the tales I used to read late at night as a child, when the world outside my window was quiet and the page seemed endless. I remember being young, staying up past bedtime, flashlight pressed to the spine of an old book, traveling with my imagination into tombs where ancient kings still breathed in the shadows. Watching this film felt like that same experience, translated into flesh and sound. What I love most about it is that it doesn't just present us with a story, it invites us to live inside a myth. I think of it often as a fable for grown-ups, an allegory about desire and death, about the persistence of love across centuries, about what it means to chase power and what it means to protect memory. If you strip away the sandstorms and the supernatural curses, you are left with the skeleton of a deeply human story. People reaching, grasping, loving, betraying, losing. Isn't that, after all, the essence of the myths we've passed down through centuries? As a film, its overview appears deceptively simple. Explorers stumble upon an ancient tomb, awaken a long-dead horror, and must contend with the consequences. But the simplicity of that structure hides a labyrinth of subtler meanings. To me, it feels like a story caught between genres, equal parts horror and romance, adventure and tragedy. One moment it carries the heart-racing rhythm of pulp serials, and the next it slows into something contemplative, almost mournful. This duality is what fascinates me. It reminds me of how life itself often oscillates between comedy and grief, between the grand and the quiet, the spectacular and the deeply human. If I were to sketch its plot for you, I'd start with the desert. A landscape as eternal as the myths that live in it. Within that desert, we meet soldiers of fortune, scholars of ancient lore, seekers driven by curiosity or greed. They uncover a tomb that should have remained sealed. Within lies a figure, cursed, punished, waiting. His resurrection is both a triumph and a tragedy, for he embodies not only terror, but also longing. What drives him is not mindless rage, but the ache of unfinished love, a passion cut short by death. That, I think, is why this film lingers so vividly in the imagination. It refuses to present its monster as merely monstrous. It gives us a being who, in his own way, mirrors our own desires. To hold on, to refuse loss, to defy time itself. Alongside him, we follow the living, the daring adventurer, all brashness and charm, masking his own scars of war and survival. The scholar, driven by her hunger for knowledge, who finds herself pulled between discovery and danger. Her brother, a character of levity who still anchors the story with his human warmth. Around them orbit mercenaries, priests, guardians sworn to protect secrets too terrible to reveal. Each character seems to embody a facet of human impulse, curiosity, greed, devotion, fear, courage. When woven together, they form a tapestry of motivations that make the story richer than its pulp trappings might suggest. The key elements, of course, lie in the resurrection of what should never have risen, in the unraveling of curses, in the race against time. But I would not rob you of the thrill of discovery by revealing too much detail. What I will tease instead is the way the narrative twists upon itself, How what begins as treasure hunting morphs into a battle for survival. How what seems like a story of horror becomes one of sacrifice, love, and memory. The major turns do not simply shock, they deepen our understanding of the characters. Each twist forces them not only to react, but to reveal who they truly are beneath the surface. For me, the most powerful undercurrent running through this film is the question of what it means to live in the shadow of history. As a child, I often felt drawn to museums, walking among relics of worlds that had vanished. I used to stand before artifacts, vases, sarcophagi, fragments of murals, and wonder, who held this, who painted that, who breathed the same air thousands of years before me? This film captures that same sensation, that eerie, exhilarating awareness that the past is not gone, that it breathes around us in ways we rarely understand. Watching it, I felt as though I were reconnecting with that childhood wonder, but also being reminded of the dangers of trying to seize what belongs to time itself. Perhaps that's why this story resonates with me so deeply. It is not only about survival against an ancient evil, it is about reckoning with our own impulse to conquer the past. How often do we, as humans, dig into history not simply to learn, but to claim, to own, to control? And how often does that impulse lead us into destruction? The film dramatizes this tension beautifully. It shows us the allure of secrets buried beneath sand, and the devastation that comes when those secrets refuse to remain buried. And yet, it also reminds us that the past is filled not only with curses, but with beauty, with stories of love so powerful they defy millennia. That duality is what elevates the film for me. It is not just spectacle, not just scares, not just adventure. It is a meditation, wrapped in entertainment, about memory, love, and the danger of tampering with forces larger than ourselves. As I think back to when I first watched it, I can still recall the way I felt. My heart racing, my eyes wide, but my mind oddly thoughtful. It was the rare experience of a film that entertained and provoked me all at once. And every time I return to it, I find something new, some gesture or symbol I hadn't noticed before, some resonance that only reveals itself after time has passed. It is, in that way, like rereading a beloved book, familiar yet endlessly rich, comforting yet continually surprising. There is something almost dreamlike about the way this story begins, as if the sands themselves are whispering the tale before any character even opens their mouth. The desert stretches out in silence, and with it comes the weight of centuries. What draws me in immediately is the way the narrative doesn't just present history. It breathes it, weaving an atmosphere where memory and myth are inseparable. The stage is set not only with spectacle, but with a sense of inevitability, as though the world has been waiting for this story to awaken. The tale begins in the age of pharaohs, with golden temples gleaming under relentless sunlight, and priests who wielded both power and fear. Within this world emerges a forbidden love, a bond so dangerous it threatens the entire kingdom. The high priest, a figure of charisma and danger, falls into an illicit affair with the pharaoh's consort. Their passion, though shrouded in secrecy, radiates through every stolen glance and furtive touch, and it is in that passion that the seeds of tragedy are sown. Love, when forbidden, burns all the brighter, and that brightness inevitably draws fire. When they are discovered, the betrayal is unforgivable. The pharaoh's rage crashes like a wave, but what is more devastating is the response of those who serve him. The punishment is cruel and absolute. The priest is condemned to an eternity of torment, sealed away with curses so ancient and terrifying that they themselves seem alive. This origin, half myth, half horror, becomes the spine of the entire narrative. It tells us from the very beginning that what we are about to see is not simply about monsters or curses, but about love's defiance of death and the brutal costs of desire. Time shifts, as time often does in stories of myth. The grandeur of temples fades, replaced by the chaos of the 20th century, a desert no less vast, but now scarred by wars and shifting powers. We meet a soldier, a man caught between worlds, someone who has wandered far enough into the sands to stumble upon what should remain hidden. He and his battalion arrive at the ruins of an ancient city. The ruins loom like a mirage, part fortress, part grave. The soldier doesn't yet understand the significance of where he stands, but the guardians who watch from the dunes understand all too well. This confrontation at the ruins is the first crack in the seal of history. There is chaos, a gunfight in the sands, men scattered by forces they cannot see, and the soldier himself narrowly escapes death. What fascinates me here is how quickly the film establishes the duality of human ambition and supernatural warning. The city does not welcome visitors, it swallows them. Yet, As humans do, they return. Curiosity has always been stronger than caution, and greed often trumps fear. The narrative shifts again, introducing us to another voice. A scholar, a woman whose life is dedicated to knowledge, whose curiosity burns not for wealth, but for understanding. Her introduction is one of my favorite moments, because it brings levity and wonder to a tale drenched in shadows. Surrounded by books, artifacts, and scrolls, she seems almost comically clumsy, yet that clumsiness hides a mind sharper than anyone around her suspects. She is the perfect counterpoint to the soldier. Where he embodies action, she embodies reflection. Where he is impulsive, she is methodical. The scholar's world collides with the soldier's when she learns of his knowledge of the ruins, and through a blend of chance and determination, she brings him into her own quest. There is something charmingly inevitable about their meeting, as though fate itself insists on uniting muscle with mind, courage with curiosity. Together with her brother, whose mischief provides a steady rhythm of humor and humanity, they set off toward the ruins that had nearly claimed the soldier's life. This journey across the desert carries its own poetry. Caravans glide across dunes under starlit skies, rival treasure hunters follow close behind, and the sense of impending revelation grows with each step. What I find remarkable here is the layering of tension. On the surface, it is an adventure story, complete with rivalries, wagers, and camaraderie. Beneath that surface, however, the audience feels the weight of ancient warnings. The guardians who once scattered soldiers are still watching, their oath to protect the secrets of the ruins as fierce as ever. This sense of dual pursuit, one group chasing treasure, another defending memory, creates a powerful undercurrent of conflict. When the explorers finally arrive, the ruins reveal themselves in fragments. Towering statues half buried in sand, gateways etched with hieroglyphs, corridors that echo with silence. The atmosphere is equal parts wonder and dread. What captivates me most about these sequences is the way they echo the act of reading a forbidden text. Each hallway they open feels like turning a page that was never meant to be read, each chamber like a paragraph charged with secrets too powerful for mortal hands. The scholar, of course, treats this with reverence. The treasure hunters treat it with greed. And the soldier, torn between loyalty and survival, becomes the bridge between the two. The unearthing of the sacred book marks the turning point. Bound in gold, inked in ancient symbols, the book is more than an object. It is a voice from the past, waiting to be heard. I often think about how literature itself is like this, a message, carried across centuries, asking to be read. And, like in literature, the act of reading becomes an act of power. The scholar, unable to resist, gives voice to words that should never be spoken aloud. The moment is delicate, quiet even, but it sends ripples through the air. The past stirs. It is here that the story shifts from wonder to terror. The guardian's worst fears come true, the curse begins to unravel, and the sands seem to shiver with anticipation. The condemned priest, long thought silenced, begins to awaken. His resurrection is grotesque, not a triumphant return, but a slow, decaying process. Each step he takes toward wholeness requires the draining of life from others, and this sets into motion a string of horrors that ripple outward from the tomb. What I find so compelling about this awakening is that it never feels like simple horror. Yes, there are plagues and death, grotesque transformations and screams in the night. But beneath all of that is the haunting reminder of why he returns. The unfinished love that began this story, the desire to reclaim what was lost. Even at his most terrifying, there is a sorrow to his existence, a shadow of longing that keeps him from becoming a flat monster. He is as much a victim of passion as he is a villain of destruction. Meanwhile, the group of explorers find themselves divided, some driven deeper into greed, others shaken into fear, and a few holding on to loyalty and duty. The soldier and the scholar, now bound by shared danger, begin to reveal more of themselves. There is a tenderness, unspoken but undeniable, that emerges between them, even as chaos grows around them. I love how the narrative allows for this kind of dual movement, outward, into spectacle and destruction, and inward, into intimacy and connection. As the ruins become less a site of discovery and more a battlefield between life and death, the tension builds like a tightening thread. The curses multiply, the guardians move openly against the intruders, and the awakened priest grows stronger with each passing moment. What began as a search for treasure has now become a desperate struggle for survival, though not everyone realizes it yet. Some still cling to their greed, believing they can control what they have unleashed. Those who understand sooner recognize that they are part of something much larger, something that has been waiting centuries to happen. By the time the first half of the tale comes to a close, we stand at the edge of catastrophe. The desert no longer feels empty. It feels alive, trembling under the weight of what has been disturbed. The explorers are no longer adventurers, not even scholars or treasure hunters. They are players in an ancient story that cares nothing for their intentions. The soldier's courage, the scholar's knowledge, the brother's humor, the guardian's oaths, all of it now collides against the unstoppable force of a love cursed by eternity. The priest who should have remained entombed is no longer a whisper of myth, but a presence stalking the living world, gathering strength from every scream and every death. His body, decayed and grotesque in its first moments of return, begins to knit itself back together with each life he consumes. Those who mocked warnings, who dismissed curses as superstition, now find themselves at the mercy of a power they cannot comprehend. One by one they fall, not in dramatic battles, but in horrific, intimate encounters. It is as if the past itself is reclaiming them, punishing them for daring to trespass upon sacred ground. The survivors feel this encroaching doom pressing in from every corner of the ruins. The soldier, who once thought only of survival and escape, now understands that he is bound to this fight, whether he wants to be or not. The scholar, racked with guilt for speaking the forbidden words that stirred the sands, realizes she holds a kind of responsibility she never expected to bear. And yet, amidst the fear, there is resolve. They are no longer simply explorers. They are guardians by necessity, standing in opposition to something that would otherwise consume the entire world. The priest's desire, however, is not destruction alone. What gives this tale its depth is his longing for what was once stolen from him. The woman he loved, the one whose death had triggered his eternal punishment. That longing, twisted and relentless, drives his every action. When his gaze settles on the scholar, it is not simply as another victim. It is as a vessel, a replacement, a chance to bring back what he lost. The thought chills me every time. The idea that love, when corrupted, can become indistinguishable from obsession. The priest's quest for reunion becomes a nightmare for the living. The guardians who had sworn centuries ago to prevent this awakening rise again, no longer content to remain hidden in the shadows. Their warnings transform into action as they attempt to stop what has already begun. But their strength, though fierce, is not enough. Against their blades and fire, the resurrected priest wields the weight of curses themselves. Plagues of insects, torrents of sand, darkness that swallows light. These sequences carry a strange beauty in their terror. The desert itself turns traitor, becoming weapon and executioner in his hands. The air becomes thick with dread, and every step forward feels like defiance against inevitability. Yet what holds the story together is not simply spectacle, but the fragile and human moments in between. The soldier and the scholar find themselves speaking in whispers amid chaos, sharing fears, confessions, and fragments of hope. Their bond, unspoken until now, emerges not in declarations, but in the way they fight side by side, in the way they look to each other when the world feels lost. The brother, often dismissed as comic relief, becomes a thread of resilience, his humor and recklessness strangely grounding even as horrors surround them. Together, they represent something the priest cannot understand. The kind of love and loyalty that isn't born from obsession, but from choice and sacrifice. The battle for survival spills out of the ruins into the broader desert. Cities far from the site of the awakening feel its ripples, as though the past is bleeding into the present with unstoppable force. There are visions of storms swallowing skylines, plagues descending upon unsuspecting citizens, the priest's influence spreading like wildfire. The guardians fight to contain it, but the truth becomes clearer with each moment. Unless the source itself is destroyed, no one will be safe. And so the narrative bends toward its climax, pulling the characters back into the heart of the ruins, back to the place where it all began. There is a poetry to this return, almost as if the story insists on completing its circle, bringing the trespassers back to the cradle of their mistake. The corridors feel narrower now, more dangerous, every flicker of torchlight illuminating symbols that seem to pulse with menace. The book, once a marvel, now feels like a curse in itself. But within its pages, and in the knowledge the scholar alone possesses, lies the only hope of ending what has been unleashed. The confrontation is inevitable. The priest, now nearly whole, towers over them not just in stature, but in presence. His power radiates from the walls. His command of the elements makes the earth itself shake. Yet what strikes me most is the duality in his eyes. Fury and longing, vengeance and sorrow, all tangled in a way that makes him terrifying and tragic all at once. His obsession with reviving his lost love reaches its peak as he attempts the ritual to claim the scholar's life and soul as a vessel. The sequence is suffused with tension. Ancient chants reverberate through the chamber, the air thick with dust and magic. The scholar, trembling but resolute, stands as both victim and fighter, her knowledge the one weapon that can counter centuries of curses. The soldier, battered and bloodied, refuses to step aside, throwing himself again and again against a force far beyond human strength. Their resistance, hopeless as it seems, is made powerful not by might but by conviction. The turning point arrives through a blend of intellect and courage. The scholar deciphers the last of the forbidden inscriptions, realizing that the same magic that revived the priest can also undo him, if wielded correctly, if spoken with precision and resolve. The book that once damned them becomes the key to salvation. What fascinates me is how this moment transforms knowledge itself into a weapon, how the act of reading, of interpreting language, becomes the fulcrum on which life and death balance. For an audience steeped in literature, this resonates deeply. Words, once again, prove to hold the greatest power of all. The ritual unravels in a storm of chaos. The priest, sensing his defeat, lashes out with fury, summoning walls of sand, swarms of insects, shrieks that seem to tear the air itself. The guardians join the fray, their ancient oath pushing them to fight to the very last breath. Amidst the chaos, the soldier and the scholar work as one, each step they take together bringing them closer to ending the nightmare. Their courage is not born of destiny, but of choice. A choice to stand against fear, to protect not only each other, but the countless lives beyond those tomb walls. The final blow is not a strike of steel, but a strike of language. The scholar's voice, steady and unwavering, carries the words that unravel the priest's immortality. The curses recoil upon him, his form crumbling not into dust but into something more haunting. Silence, as though the sands themselves exhale in relief. His screams echo and then fade, swallowed by the very tomb that had once imprisoned him. Love, obsession, vengeance. All of it is buried once again beneath centuries of stone and sand. When the dust settles, what remains is not triumph but exhaustion, a quiet recognition of what has been survived. The ruins stand as they did before, silent and ominous, their secrets intact once more. The guardians fade back into the shadows, their task renewed, but their presence barely acknowledged by history. The soldier, the scholar, and her brother emerge into the desert sun changed, scarred, perhaps, but alive. There is no chest of gold, no treasure to parade before the world. What they carry instead is the knowledge of what they faced, and the bond forged in surviving it. What lingers after the climax is not horror, but reflection. The story has always been, at its heart, about the danger of disturbing what we don't understand, the peril of letting greed or curiosity blind us to warnings etched across time. Yet it is also about resilience, about the way love and loyalty can stand against forces older and greater than any human being. The soldier and the scholar, though perhaps too different to have met in ordinary life, have become part of each other's survival in extraordinary circumstances. Their bond is the true treasure unearthed from the sands. The desert, as always, remains eternal, its dunes shifting, its winds carrying whispers of stories long past. But for those who walked its ruins, who faced the wrath of history itself, the memory is unforgettable. The tale closes with an air of bittersweet peace. The evil defeated, the curse contained, but the reminder forever carved into their souls that some secrets are not meant to be touched. The characters of this story are not merely figures moving through a plot. They are vessels through which timeless questions unfold, about love, loyalty, ambition, fear, and the endless tug-of-war between humanity and the unknown. To approach them simply as archetypes would be too shallow, because what makes them unforgettable is not only what they symbolize, but also how they breathe, how they stumble, how they reveal glimpses of flaws that remind us of ourselves. Their presence lingers long after the sands settle, because we recognize pieces of our own humanity in them, even when cloaked in myth, spectacle, or horror. The soldier at the heart of this tale embodies the paradox of strength and vulnerability. On the surface, he is every inch the adventurer, broad-shouldered, quick with a weapon, reckless in the face of danger. Yet beneath that bravado lies something more delicate, an instinct for survival that masks loneliness, a longing for belonging disguised as cynicism. He fights not because he relishes violence, but because life has given him few alternatives. What captivates me about him is that shift, the moment when survival alone is no longer enough. He begins the story as someone drifting, existing without purpose, but when confronted with the enormity of ancient evil, he discovers within himself not only courage but conviction. The arc of his character is not about learning how to fight. He already knows that, but about learning what is worth fighting for. His connection with the scholar transforms him, not through sweeping declarations of romance, but through shared danger, shared struggle, and a recognition of her courage that awakens his own. It is through her that he discovers loyalty, and through loyalty, he discovers meaning. The scholar herself is perhaps the most intriguing presence of all. She enters the story as someone defined by curiosity, brilliant, wide-eyed, eager to uncover truths long buried. Her love of knowledge is both admirable and dangerous, for it blinds her to warnings, convinces her that the written word can be wielded without consequence. When she utters the incantation that unleashes the priest, she embodies the dual nature of intellect, the gift of discovery and the curse of arrogance. What moves me about her journey is not that she stumbles, but how she rises from those mistakes. Her arc is one of guilt transfigured into responsibility. Rather than retreat into denial, she claims her role in the chaos and transforms her knowledge into a weapon of resistance. By the story's end, she is no longer the wide-eyed dreamer gazing at ancient texts with naive wonder. She has become a figure of strength, intellectual, emotional, and moral, showing us that true wisdom is born not from perfect choices, but from the courage to face the consequences of imperfect ones. The brother, who at first glance appears to be a foil, a figure of comic relief, is more important than he seems. His recklessness, his greed, his tendency to bumble through dangerous situations all serve to highlight the gravity of the world surrounding him. Yet in his levity lies a strange resilience. Where others despair, he deflects with humor. Where others are paralyzed by fear, he stumbles forward with misguided bravado. This does not mean he is fearless. It means he survives by making light of fear. I see in him the embodiment of how ordinary people cope with overwhelming circumstances. Not through heroics, but through laughter, denial, or clumsy attempts at escape. And yet, when it matters most, he proves himself capable of loyalty and courage, however begrudgingly. His role reminds us that humanity is not always noble, but it is persistent, and sometimes persistence itself is a form of bravery. Then there is the priest, the dark heart of the tale, whose presence eclipses every shadow. What makes him so fascinating is not simply his power, but the origin of that power. Love corrupted into obsession, devotion twisted into defiance of death. His story begins in tragedy, his forbidden love, the punishment that entombed him alive, and it is tempting to pity him for the cruelty of his fate. Yet when he rises again, that sorrow curdles into horror. His quest to reclaim what was taken becomes monstrous, his longing transforming into a hunger that consumes without mercy. He kills not for conquest, but as a means to an end, to restore the woman he once loved, no matter the cost to others. That single-minded pursuit makes him terrifying, because it strips away every shred of empathy and reduces him to a vessel of obsession. What unsettles me most is how human his motivation is, even in its monstrosity. Who among us has not yearned for the impossible return of someone lost? Who has not felt the ache of grief, so deep it tempts the mind with impossible bargains? His tragedy lies in the fact that his love, rather than ennobling him, destroys him and everything around him. The woman whose death set these events into motion, though she appears only in fragments, exerts a presence far greater than her screen time. She is memory, desire, and symbol all at once. In life, she represented forbidden passion. In death, she becomes the prism through which the priest's obsession is refracted. Her absence is a character in itself, haunting every choice, every act of destruction carried out in her name. What I find poignant is how the story refuses to grant her voice or agency in her resurrection. She becomes an object of desire rather than a subject of her own destiny, a reminder of how love can sometimes erase as much as it elevates. Her role is unsettling not for what she does, but for how she is used, as symbol, as vessel, as echo, and that in itself is a commentary on how obsession can strip humanity from the very person it claims to cherish. The guardians who appear as protectors of the ancient world occupy a different symbolic plane. They are duty incarnate, figures who exist not for themselves, but for the vow they inherited. Their presence serves as a counterpoint to the greed and curiosity of the explorers. Where others see treasure, they see danger. Where others hear myths, they hear oaths. Their loyalty is not to the present, but to the past, and in this, they embody a kind of nobility that feels both inspiring and tragic. They fight knowing they may never be recognized, never thanked, never remembered, because their cause is larger than themselves. And yet, in the face of overwhelming odds, they remain steadfast. I see in them a reflection of all those who labor in silence, whose sacrifices shape the world without acknowledgement. Their role is small in dialogue, but immense in meaning. What ties all these characters together is the way they reflect aspects of humanity in extremis. The soldier shows us the yearning for purpose, the scholar, the perils and rewards of knowledge, the brother, the resilience of ordinary flaws, the priest, the destructive side of love, the guardians, the weight of duty. Together, they form a tapestry of contrasts, greed and sacrifice, fear and courage, obsession and loyalty. None of them are perfect, and that imperfection is what makes them compelling. They stumble, they err, they laugh at inappropriate moments, they love clumsily, they grieve violently. And in these flaws, we recognize truth. The relationships between them deepen this resonance. The soldier and scholar's partnership grows not from immediate attraction, but from shared trials. It is a love forged in fire, a bond that does not need declarations to be understood. The brother, irritating yet steadfast, reveals that even the most exasperating companion can be invaluable in the darkest moments. The priest and his lost love form the shadow reflection of this. Their bond born of passion but transformed into destruction, showing us what happens when love loses balance. Even the desert itself, while not a character in the human sense, acts as one in this tale. Its shifting sands, its merciless storms, its ancient ruins, all serve as a silent witness and participant. The environment mirrors the inner struggles of the characters, vast, unforgiving, but hiding moments of fragile beauty. As I reflect on these figures, I am struck by how their arcs converge toward a single theme. What does it mean to be human in the face of forces beyond comprehension? Some cling to greed, others to duty, others to love. Some are destroyed by their choices, while others are ennobled. But each is, in their own way, utterly human, messy, contradictory, full of longing and fear. There is something endlessly fascinating about the way stories exist not only on the screen but behind it. How a film is not simply what we watch, but also a living, breathing patchwork of accidents, improvisations, coincidences, and human determination. When I think about this particular adventure, what strikes me most is that its strangeness didn't just come from the curses, tombs, or mystical resurrections woven into the narrative. It came also from the many odd, surprising, and downright peculiar things that unfolded during its creation. To explore these unusual details is to wander through an entirely different story, one in which actors, directors, technicians, and even chance itself became characters, shaping the outcome in ways they themselves could hardly predict. What I love most about uncovering these hidden truths is how they remind us of the humanity behind cinema. For every polished scene of magic and terror we remember, there was someone holding a camera in the desert sun, someone sewing together costumes from fragile fabrics, someone keeping time against the relentlessness of a shooting schedule. And sometimes, despite all the preparation in the world, chaos still slipped in, leaving behind anecdotes that now feel like campfire tales whispered among those who cherish this film. One of the strangest elements of its production was how it was plagued by actual danger. On set, the desert was not an abstract idea, not merely a backdrop for exotic danger, but a real, unforgiving environment. The actors and crew had to contend with temperatures that soared to unbearable highs during the day and plunged shockingly at night. Sandstorms would sweep in without warning, covering expensive equipment and halting production entirely. There were moments when visibility dropped so suddenly that entire scenes had to be reimagined. To make matters stranger, the crew often joked that the land itself didn't want to yield its secrets, as though the desert were conspiring to protect the very myths the film sought to dramatize. The actor at the heart of the story, rugged, adventurous, charming, suffered more than just the sweat and dust. In one particularly harrowing moment, he nearly lost consciousness during a scene that required him to be hanged. The stunt, though carefully choreographed, went wrong when the rope tightened too much around his neck, cutting off air. For several terrifying seconds, he dangled between acting and reality, his face turning pale until crew members realized something was wrong and rushed to cut him down. Later, he would recount it with a mixture of humor and horror. But that moment stands as one of the eeriest reminders that sometimes the line between fiction and reality blurs too dangerously. Then there was the scholar, portrayed by an actress whose wit and intelligence shone through every frame. She too had her share of unusual struggles. Filming required her to spend hours in sets filled with rats, beetles, and other crawling creatures. Many of these were real, not conjured up by digital trickery. There is a strange authenticity in knowing that her screams and disgust were not manufactured, but utterly genuine. One scene involving scarabs had her practically leaping out of her skin, her fear so convincing precisely because it wasn't performance. It was a reaction to dozens of wriggling insects released around her. Even knowing she was an actor, her unease was infectious, and the crew whispered about how the bugs seemed almost too perfectly timed, too eager to play their part. The brothers' actor found himself in another kind of bizarre predicament. His role often required him to carry antiques, treasure, or fragile props. One story that has since become legendary involves him dropping a centuries-old replica artifact mid-scene. Though it was meant to be a prop, the piece had been carefully constructed to mimic real ancient craftsmanship. The crash of it shattering echoed across the set, and the crew stood in stunned silence. Yet rather than cut, the director laughed, insisting the clumsy break fit the character perfectly. That ruined prop found immortality on film, woven into the performance as though it had always been intended. And then there were the animals. Horses were essential to many of the desert scenes, but they often had minds of their own. One horse in particular became infamous among the crew for refusing to cooperate, bolting at random times or stubbornly planting its hooves in the sand and refusing to move. During one chaotic take, it threw its rider unexpectedly, leading to a minor injury and much shouting. Rather than cutting the horse out, the director adapted, reshaping sequences to work around its behavior. The result is that some of the most naturalistic moments on screen were not the product of careful design, but the unpredictable stubbornness of an animal who refused to obey cinematic convention. Equally strange was the way superstition clung to the production like a second skin. Many of those involved confessed to feeling an odd heaviness, as if working with ancient curses and tomb imagery stirred something unsettled. There were tales of crew members waking in the night plagued by vivid dreams, some of which mirrored the story they were filming. Others reported inexplicable illnesses or strings of bad luck while on location. One crew member swore that after touching a particular set piece modeled after a sarcophagus, he fell sick for days without explanation. Though the rational mind dismisses such claims as coincidence, the whispers of curses added a thrill of genuine eeriness to the long nights of filming. The director himself was no stranger to improvisation in the face of strangeness. He had set out to make a film that balanced horror and adventure, seriousness and humor. Yet on more than one occasion, the oddest accidents shaped his vision. In one scene, a carefully designed practical effect involving collapsing sand failed spectacularly. Instead of tumbling gracefully, it slumped in a heap. Rather than scrap the footage, the director saw potential, reworking the camera angles to turn failure into a surreal, memorable moment. It fascinates me that what audiences now praise as a striking visual was born not from perfection, but from imperfection. Proof that art often thrives when plans collapse. Technology, too, played its part in strangeness. The film was produced at a time when digital effects were still evolving, and much of what was attempted had never been done on such a scale. The priest's resurrection, with his body regenerating piece by piece, was groundbreaking for its time. Yet what we see on screen, polished and seamless, belies the fact that behind the curtain the technology was temperamental, prone to glitches that turned horrifying imagery into laughable distortions. One animator recalled how a rendering error left the priest's face stretched grotesquely across the screen, eyes and mouth misplaced in nightmare proportions. To this day, crew members laugh about how close those errors came to derailing the illusion. Even the choice of filming locations brought with them strange stories. Though the desert settings look convincingly Egyptian, much of the shooting actually took place in Morocco. This choice came with logistical challenges that spiraled into bizarre situations. Local guides sometimes warned the cast against wandering too far, claiming the land held ancient spirits. One actor recounted how, during a night shoot, he wandered beyond the set lights and heard chanting in the distance. Whether it was locals, crew members playing a prank, or something else entirely, he could never say, but he returned shaken. For the rest of the production, he avoided straying from the safety of the crew. What fascinates me about these tales is not simply their oddity, but how they shaped the final product. Each accident, superstition, and mishap added an invisible texture, a lived-in authenticity. The near-fatal stunt imbued the central performance with a rawness that cannot be faked. The genuine fear of bugs made the scholar's terror resonate with audiences on a deeper level. The brothers' clumsy prop mishap created comedy that felt spontaneous rather than scripted. Even the malfunctioning effects and disobedient horses pushed the filmmakers to inventiveness. And then there are the little-known details, the trivia that makes you look at familiar scenes with new eyes. The scarab beetles, for example, which appear so terrifying as they swarm across the sand, were largely created through clever practical tricks and digital layering. In reality, the insects used on set were harmless species, often reluctant to cooperate. The illusion of their menace came not from nature itself, but from the tireless patience of handlers and the skill of editors who stitched together fragments until chaos appeared seamless. Another tidbit that delights me involves the costumes. The desert robes, uniforms, and treasures were not merely thrown together, but carefully researched, borrowing details from historical archives while deliberately stylizing them for cinematic impact. Yet despite this attention to detail, the costumes constantly rebelled against the desert conditions. Leather cracked in the sun, fabrics tore in the wind, jewelry grew scorching hot against the skin. There is something strangely poetic about how even the costumes resisted the intrusion of cinema into the desert, as though the land itself reminded everyone that it could not be fully tamed. I think what makes these stories so compelling is how they highlight the precarious balance between control and chaos in filmmaking. A director may plan, an actor may prepare, a designer may perfect, but the world itself, whether animals, chance, always has a vote. And sometimes, that vote reshapes the story in ways no one could have imagined. Looking back, it is almost impossible not to marvel at the convergence of all these peculiarities. The desert storms that halted filming, the stunt that nearly ended in tragedy, the insects that refused to play along, the animals that defied their riders, the superstitions that haunted sleepless nights. All of it coalesced into a film that feels alive, unpredictable, pulsing with a strange energy. Perhaps that is why it continues to resonate, because beneath the polished veneer lies a history of struggle, laughter, fear, and accident. When I think back to this film, the memory doesn't sit with me as a neat sequence of scenes or a tidy list of highlights. It lingers like a tapestry, woven from threads of adventure, horror, humor, and something harder to name, something that borders on myth. To walk through its significant events from a critical perspective is to trace the threads of that tapestry, tugging at the places where they overlap, fray, or unexpectedly bind together. It isn't just a matter of summarizing what happens, but of asking why those happenings feel so powerful, why they've endured in memory, and what they whisper about the human condition beneath all the spectacle. The opening event sets the stage with a grandeur that feels almost biblical. We are transported to an ancient time, where betrayal, forbidden love, and punishment fuse into a story that explains everything to come. It is not just an introduction. It is a mythic prologue, positioning the audience in a world where the sins of the past bleed into the present. From a critical standpoint, what fascinates me here is how the film immediately insists on history as a living force. The execution of the high priest, the horrific ritual that condemns him, is not merely backstory, but a promise. The past will not stay buried. This alone resonates with a deeply literary sensibility. Myth, after all, is always about unfinished business, about what refuses to be forgotten. Watching that sandstorm of curses rise in the opening, I remember feeling that the story wasn't really about him alone, but about humanity's habit of repeating mistakes. Lust, greed, vengeance, across centuries. Then we leap forward, and suddenly we are in a different story. Soldiers, deserts, crumbling fortresses under siege. On the surface, this might feel like a disjointed jump, but critically, it achieves something brilliant. It tells us that this is not just a horror tale. It is an adventure, a clash between myth and the modern world. The chaos of gunfire and the desperation of soldiers caught in a sandstorm are thrilling, yes, but beneath that lies an emotional rhythm. We see men caught between survival and myth, too small to understand what they've stumbled into, and yet drawn into its gravity. To me, this event, the sandstorm swallowing armies, works as a meditation on insignificance. Humanity can fight with bullets and cannons, but the desert, and the ancient power it hides, does not bend to such weapons. When the story introduces its central trio, the adventurer, the scholar, and her brother, the tone shifts again, this time to one of levity and promise. Here lies one of the film's cleverest tricks. By blending humor into the adventure, it disarms the audience just enough to make the later horror more potent. From a critical perspective, the first meeting between the scholar and the adventurer is not merely comedic, it's thematic. She is cautious, intellectual, bookish. He is rugged, reckless, instinct-driven. And yet, from the moment they clash, we sense that the story isn't about one world conquering the other, but about the meeting of opposites, the merging of knowledge and courage. Their dynamic echoes a timeless literary theme, that wisdom and bravery must walk hand in hand if humanity is to survive what lies in the dark. There's a particular moment early on that always stays with me. The scholar accidentally causing destruction in the library, toppling shelves of books in a chain reaction. On the surface, it's slapstick, a bit of comic relief. But I've always thought of it as symbolic. Here is a woman of knowledge, buried in texts and artifacts, yet clumsy in the physical world. She can scatter centuries of wisdom in a moment, not out of malice, but out of human fallibility. Isn't that what the story is about? How easily humanity disrupts history, how carelessly we disturb what we barely understand. That small comic accident feels to me like foreshadowing of the much greater accident to come, the unearthing of a curse better left untouched. The journey into the desert, when the characters finally set out toward the lost city, marks another turning point. The desert is not merely backdrop here. It functions like a character, a threshold between the ordinary world and the mythic. I've always admired how the filmmakers chose to frame it. Endless sand, glaring sunlight, caravans that look fragile against its immensity. Critically, it's a space of testing, a liminal place where the trappings of modern life, books, guns, arrogance, begin to dissolve. In literature, deserts often symbolize purification, trial, or revelation, and that symbolism saturates this section of the film. The caravan feels like a pilgrimage, though none of the travelers quite realize it. They think they're chasing treasure, but the desert is already reshaping them, stripping away illusions. One of the film's most significant events, in my view, is the arrival at the hidden city. The competing groups, our trio, the mercenaries, the treasure seekers, each represent a different attitude toward history. Some are reverent, some greedy, some curious, some cynical. Watching them descend into the ruins, I cannot help but think of explorers and colonizers throughout history, plunging into foreign lands with little regard for the cultures or consequences of their actions. From a critical perspective, the tomb itself becomes a mirror. Those who seek only gold see only gold. Those who seek knowledge glimpse something far deeper, though at great risk. This is why the film's structure feels almost allegorical. It is about how humanity approaches the past, whether with reverence, curiosity, or exploitation. And then comes the central catastrophe, the reading of the sacred book, the unsealing of what should never be disturbed. This event is, of course, the pivot upon which the entire narrative spins, and its brilliance lies in its duality. On the surface, it is a thrilling moment of horror. A corpse stirring, the air thick with dread, plagues unleashed upon the living. But looked at more deeply, it is a moral lesson about knowledge itself. The scholar's impulse to read, to uncover, to awaken, is not portrayed as villainous, but as profoundly human. We are creatures who cannot resist the forbidden. Literature, religion, myth, all warn us against opening doors we are told to leave shut, and yet we open them anyway. This moment, with its eerie chanting and sudden dread, feels like the embodiment of that eternal paradox. Knowledge liberates, but it also curses. As the plagues descend, the river turning to blood, swarms of locusts darkening the sky, what strikes me critically is not just the spectacle, but the layering of symbolism. These events echo biblical punishments, suggesting that the universe itself reacts when humanity disturbs sacred order. Yet the film doesn't lean on dogma. It reframes these myths as cinematic terror, making the old stories feel alive again. I remember watching the locust swarm, the sheer panic of the characters, and realizing how myth and cinema can conspire to strike at something primal. Even if one doesn't believe in curses, there is an undeniable unease in watching ancient plagues come to life. Another key event that stands out is the transformation of the resurrected priest. His body, at first incomplete and horrifyingly decayed, gradually restores itself with each life he consumes. This is both grotesque and fascinating from a critical standpoint. It visualizes the theme of consumption, not just physical but spiritual. He feeds on life to rebuild himself, a mirror of how humanity feeds on history, culture, and even destruction to build its own empires. The horror of his regeneration is not simply the flesh knitting together, but what it implies. That survival, in this story, comes at the cost of others. That idea, uncomfortable as it is, resonates with a broader commentary on greed and exploitation. Of course, the film is not only about horror and myth. It is also about relationships, about how people grow when pressed against the edge of survival. The blossoming connection between the scholar and the adventurer becomes one of the most emotionally resonant threads. In a lesser story, their romance might feel tacked on, but here it emerges organically, born of mutual respect forged in fire. Critically, their bond symbolizes the union of intellect and action, of the written word and the lived deed. Watching them fight side by side against impossible odds, I find myself thinking of countless literary pairings where opposites converge to form something stronger. Their love is not sentimental fluff, it is a metaphor for balance. The climax, where all threads converge in the chaotic battle against the resurrected evil, is perhaps the most thrilling event. Yet what fascinates me critically is how it plays with scale. On one hand, the fate of the world hangs in balance. On the other, it is deeply personal, a small group of flawed, brave humans pitted against an immortal force. This duality, the epic and the intimate, gives the climax its resonance. When the characters finally manage to defeat him, sealing him away once more, it doesn't feel like triumph alone. It feels bittersweet, as though they have merely delayed the inevitable cycle of history. Evil, greed, curses, they are never truly gone. They only slumber until the next generation awakens them. What lingers for me after revisiting these events is the film's ability to blend tones without collapsing under them. Adventure, horror, comedy, romance, all coexist, each amplifying the other. From a critical perspective, this tonal alchemy is no accident. It reflects the human experience itself, where joy and terror, love and loss, curiosity and fear are never neatly separated. By stitching these elements together, the film achieves something rare. It entertains while also whispering truths about the human condition. And as for its reception, it is easy to see why audiences embraced it so wholeheartedly. The spectacle thrilled, the humor charmed, the romance warmed, and the horror chilled. But beneath those pleasures lay the resonance of myth, the echo of ancient tales reimagined for a new age. That, I think, is why it has endured, why people return to it not just for nostalgia, but for the strange sense that in its events we glimpse something timeless. When I look back on the making of this film, what strikes me most is that its story behind the camera feels as wild, improbable, and adventurous as the one that ended up on the screen. It's easy, years later, to watch the final product and take it all for granted. The sweeping desert shots, the larger-than-life monsters, the moments of comedy that slip so effortlessly into the horror. But in truth, none of it came easily. It was stitched together from sweat, near disasters, bold gambles, and moments of serendipity that make you wonder if the film itself was fated to exist. The idea of resurrecting an old property from Hollywood's golden age was not exactly fashionable at the time. Studios had been toying with the concept for years, dusting off scripts that never quite felt right. The 1930s original had been a straightforward horror story, brooding and atmospheric, but audiences of the late 1990s wanted something more kinetic. This tension, between preserving the aura of classic monster cinema and making something that felt like a blockbuster, was the seed of everything that followed. And from that seed grew a project that no one quite predicted would take on a life of its own. The director, who at the time was known but not yet celebrated, fought tooth and nail to pitch the story not as pure horror, but as an epic adventure in the style of old pulp serials. He had this vision of Indiana Jones colliding with gothic terror, of laughter bubbling up right alongside screams. Studio executives hesitated. They wanted to know whether audiences would buy into such a tonal cocktail. But he insisted, saying that horror alone would be too narrow, while adventure alone would feel too shallow. It was the blend that mattered. And somehow, against the odds, the gamble was greenlit. What no one predicted, though, was how grueling it would be to actually film much of it. The production crew found themselves scattered across Morocco, standing under a sun so hot it seemed to pierce the skin. Cast and crew alike suffered dehydration, sunburns, and the endless sting of blowing sand. At one point, the heat soared so high that cameras had to be shielded with special coverings to keep their inner mechanics from melting down. Actors were instructed to drink constantly, and stories began circulating about one of them carrying an 4 drip just to stay upright between takes. These weren't just inconveniences. They shaped the very mood of the set, where everyone felt as though they were living inside the film's themes of survival against hostile forces. But the desert also offered gifts. The vast, untouched landscapes gave the film a grandeur that could never have been faked on a soundstage. There are accounts of the crew standing silently at dawn, watching the sun bleed across the dunes, feeling a mixture of awe and insignificance. In those moments, the hardships felt worthwhile. Later, when you see the caravan trundling across endless sand, or the fortress rising like a mirage on the horizon, it's easy to forget that what you're looking at is real. Not green screen trickery, but the earth itself, indifferent and eternal. Still, not everything could be captured naturally. The production relied heavily on computer-generated imagery, which at the time was still in a transitional stage. What they attempted was unprecedented. A living corpse whose decayed face would morph and rebuild itself, plagues of locusts and scarabs that swarmed with nightmarish precision, sandstorms that took on the contours of a human face. The technology simply wasn't ready for many of these effects, but the filmmakers were determined to push boundaries. Animators spent weeks studying anatomy, textbooks, skeleton models, and even cadavers to figure out how a body might realistically knit itself back together. Some of the first test shots were laughably clunky, but instead of abandoning the vision, the team doubled down. That blend of stubbornness and imagination paid off. The final results stunned audiences at the time, pushing visual effects into new territory. Behind the scenes, though, the cast endured far more than digital trickery. One of the most remarkable stories involves the lead actor, who came perilously close to losing consciousness while filming a hanging scene. The stunt had been carefully planned, but a miscalculation led to the rope tightening more than intended. He blacked out, dangling for a few terrifying seconds before the crew rushed in to save him. In later interviews, he spoke of waking up confused, staring at worried faces, and realizing how close he had come to a very different ending. It became one of those whispered stories on set, a reminder that movie magic often carries real danger. Other moments, however, leaned toward the absurd. The actress playing the scholarly heroine had to spend hours perfecting the pronunciation of ancient Egyptian lines, only for many of those takes to be cut or altered in editing. She joked that she'd spent weeks learning how to speak to the dead, only for the film to bury most of it anyway. Her preparation wasn't wasted, though. Her precision lent credibility to the scenes, grounding the film's fantastical elements in a sense of genuine scholarship. Watching her read from a dusty tome or explain hieroglyphs, you believe her completely, even if the camera cuts away before the full line leaves her mouth. One of the strangest anecdotes comes from the swarm of scarabs that infest the film's most unsettling sequences. Though many were created with computers, the crew also experimented with real beetles for close-up shots. Wranglers brought boxes of shiny, scuttling creatures onto set, placing them carefully for cameras to capture their twitching legs and gleaming shells. The actors, understandably, were less than thrilled. Imagine lying still while live beetles crawled over your skin, knowing that somewhere nearby, a wrangler was waiting with tweezers to pluck them away if they ventured too close to your eyes or mouth. The discomfort was real, and it shows in the jittery authenticity of those scenes. There were, of course, lighter moments too. The cast developed a camaraderie born of hardship, sharing jokes to break the tension of long, punishing days. One running gag involved the curse of the production itself. Equipment breaking mysteriously, sandstorms rolling in just as a perfect shot was ready, even food supplies spoiling overnight. Crew members began to half-seriously suggest that the ancient ruins they filmed near might truly be haunted. Superstitions flourished. Some refused to step inside certain tombs until incense had been burned. These playful rituals became part of the fabric of the shoot, a way of coping with the uncanny atmosphere that seemed to surround them. And then there were the accidents that became happy discoveries. During one scene, a camel unexpectedly made a grumpy sound, breaking the seriousness of the moment. Instead of reshooting, the director loved the spontaneity and kept it, adding a layer of humor that fans later adored. Another time, the desert winds blew so fiercely that dust obscured the cameras entirely. What seemed like a ruined day ended up giving them hauntingly beautiful footage of figures half-shrouded in storm, perfectly fitting the mood of impending doom. Perhaps the greatest fun fact, though, lies in how much of the film was shaped by improvisation and instinct. Many of the most memorable comedic exchanges weren't scripted word for word, but grew from the actors' natural chemistry. The lead actor, in particular, had a gift for balancing intensity with wry humor, tossing off lines in ways that surprised even the director. The film's tone, part earnest adventure, part tongue-in-cheek romp, was not something meticulously engineered. It emerged organically from the people making it, from the way they coped with the pressures of the set. When the film finally wrapped, few could predict how it would land with audiences. Some feared it would be dismissed as camp. Others worried that its mix of genres would confuse viewers. What happened instead was something closer to alchemy. Audiences embraced it wholeheartedly, swept up in its blend of spectacle and charm. Critics may have quibbled about historical accuracy or tonal shifts, but audiences didn't care. They felt the joy and danger that had animated the production itself, and they carried that feeling home. Looking back, what fascinates me most is how the struggles and accidents of the production mirror the film's own themes. Just as the characters stumble through ruins, facing curses, improvising their way out of peril, so too did the crew stumble through heat waves, technical glitches, and near disasters. Both stories, the one on screen and the one behind the camera, speak to the same truth. Creation is messy, unpredictable, and often perilous. But when people commit with passion, even chaos can yield something enduring. There are times when I think the real star of this film isn't the actors, nor even the story itself, but the world that the filmmakers conjured around it. The setting, those landscapes and interiors, and the way they're captured through the lens, feels almost like a breathing character of its own. Sometimes guiding the story, sometimes shadowing it, sometimes rising up in rebellion against the fragile human figures who dare to wander through its depths. When I think back on it, I realize the places we inhabit in this movie are more than backdrops. They are mood, they are metaphor, they are memory themselves. It begins, of course, with the desert. There is something timeless about an endless ocean of sand, something that transcends culture and history and touches a primal part of the human psyche. That desert is both alluring and terrifying. Its beauty lies in its silence, its hostility in its vastness. In those opening moments, when the camera sweeps across dunes glowing like fire under the sun, I can almost feel the dryness in my own throat, almost sense the grit of wind-blown sand in my teeth. The desert is indifferent, yet in its indifference lies its power. It mocks human ambition. Kingdoms rise and fall, monuments crumble, but the sands remain. And when the characters march across those rolling dunes, I don't just see them moving toward adventure. I see them swallowed by something larger than themselves. The film doesn't settle for a single vision of the desert either. At times it is golden, bathed in warm light that invites curiosity, even romance. At other times, under shadow or storm, it feels predatory, alive with menace. There's a moment when the wind lifts and whips a storm into the sky, and the very air seems to form faces, as if the land itself had taken offense at being trespassed upon. That blending of setting with supernatural threat is what makes it unforgettable. The desert isn't simply where the story happens. It is the story, its silence and violence woven directly into the danger the characters face. And then, there are the ruins, the tombs and temples and half-buried cities that lie under the surface, waiting to be unearthed. These spaces are claustrophobic in a way the desert is not. While the desert swallows you in its immensity, the tombs swallow you in confinement. The walls are carved with ancient symbols, lit only by flickering torchlight that barely pushes back the shadows. The cinematography here is deliberate. Low, wide shots that make you feel the weight of stone pressing in from all sides, close-ups that linger on glyphs and murals, as if they might still whisper secrets. The sound design heightens this claustrophobia. The echo of footsteps, the creak of ancient doors, the scurrying of unseen creatures. It's here that the atmosphere transforms into something intimate and suffocating, where every corner feels like a trap, every silence like a prelude to horror. Yet the tombs are not just places of dread. They carry a lore too. The camera lingers on gold gleaming in the torchlight, on the delicate craftsmanship of relics, on the sheer wonder of forgotten civilizations. The lighting design is crucial here. Sometimes the treasures sparkle so brightly that for a moment we forget the danger. But inevitably, the shadows creep back in, reminding us that beauty here is bait, that greed is punished. In this way, the setting itself mirrors the dual nature of myth: irresistible temptation and inevitable doom. What has always fascinated me is how the film transitions between these contrasting spaces: the blinding openness of the desert, the suffocating intimacy of the tombs, and the in-between spaces of bustling cities. Cairo, for instance, is portrayed as vibrant chaos, a living tapestry of color and sound. The cinematography shifts here: busier framing, warmer hues, crowded streets where people brush shoulder to shoulder. The city scenes ground the story in something tangible, human, and immediate before plunging us back into the uncanny emptiness of the desert or the haunted silence of ruins. It's a contrast that keeps the viewer off balance. One moment immersed in the messy vitality of a marketplace, the next moment stepping into corridors untouched for millennia. There's a deliberate rhythm in how these settings are arranged, almost like musical composition. Bright, chaotic, living spaces give way to stark, empty, eternal ones. The filmmakers use this rhythm to control emotional intensity. After a tense tomb sequence, we might return to a sunlit campsite where characters joke and laugh. Just when the desert begins to feel too monotonous, we're thrust into labyrinthine hallways underground. It's this shifting landscape that prevents the story from ever stagnating, that keeps us, like the characters, unsure of what awaits around the next bend. Cinematography is at the heart of all this. Wide establishing shots stretch out the scale of the desert until the characters look like ants crawling across eternity. Conversely, close-ups inside the tombs capture the flicker of fear in their eyes, the beads of sweat on their brows. The contrast is deliberate. Grandeur versus intimacy, insignificance versus mortality. One of my favorite visual choices comes during a moment of panic underground, when the camera swirls in dizzying circles, tracking a character's frantic breathing as torchlight swings across walls crowded with hieroglyphs. It makes the viewer feel trapped right alongside them, overwhelmed by a world far older and stranger than human comprehension. Lighting plays perhaps the most significant role in establishing tone. Daytime desert scenes burn with a relentless brightness that strips away illusion. You cannot hide in that sun, cannot deny its harshness. But night scenes transform the landscape into something dreamlike, even romantic, as if the desert itself softens under moonlight. In contrast, the tomb interiors rely on shadows and flickering light, creating constant uncertainty about what might be lurking just beyond vision. Darkness is rarely total. It teases rather than obscures, allowing our imaginations to fill in what we cannot quite see. That tension, between what is illuminated and what is hidden, is exactly the tension the characters themselves experience as they peel back layers of history better left undisturbed. Sound design is another weapon used to bring setting alive. The desert sequences are often filled with wind, a sound that is at once soothing and sinister, a reminder of both the desert's beauty and its hostility. In tombs, silence dominates, broken by the smallest noises, stone grinding, insects skittering, the faintest whispers of breath. These silences are just as important as dialogue, amplifying suspense and forcing us to listen harder. Even in the city, the soundscape is immersive, crowds bustling, animals braying, vendors calling. You don't just see these places, you hear them, and through sound you feel them. What intrigues me most is how the setting becomes symbolic, a kind of mirror for the characters' journeys. The desert, with its endless openness, mirrors their ambition and desire for freedom, but also their vulnerability. The tombs, with their claustrophobic traps, mirror their fears, their entanglement with greed and history. The city, chaotic and human, mirrors their relationships, their capacity for connection and conflict. In this way, the setting is not passive but active. It reflects, amplifies, and sometimes even dictates the choices characters make. Consider, for example, how romance plays against these backdrops. A love story in a modern cafe would feel cliché, but here, when two characters share a moment of tenderness under a star-studded desert sky, it feels eternal. The vast emptiness makes their closeness more meaningful. Likewise, when tension erupts underground, the setting itself becomes complicit, pressing them together, sealing off escape, demanding confrontation. This intertwining of human drama with place is what elevates the film from spectacle to myth. There are also subtler visual motifs woven into the settings. Repeated images of doors opening, ancient gates, tomb entrances, even the simple flap of a tent, mark moments of transition, both literal and symbolic. Mirrors of sand and water, rare oases gleaming amidst barrenness, echo themes of life and death. Hieroglyphs carved into stone serve as silent narrators, telling stories no one fully deciphers, but everyone feels. These recurring elements remind us that the settings are layered with meaning, not just backdrops but texts waiting to be read. And the colors, the palette shifts so intentionally that it shapes mood before we even realize it. Golden yellows and deep oranges dominate desert days, evoking heat and exhaustion. Blues and purples mark nights, bringing mystery and calm. Inside tombs, earthy browns and inky blacks dominate, pierced occasionally by the glitter of gold or the red of torch flames. Each palette carries emotion, exhaustion, or fear, wonder. The visual storytelling works even when dialogue is minimal, teaching us to read the world around the characters like a coded language. Even the costumes and props intertwine with the settings to reinforce tone. Dusty fabrics blend into sand, making characters seem part of the desert itself. Shiny relics gleam unnaturally in shadowy tombs, beckoning like forbidden fruit. The way characters physically interact with these environments, their stumbling in sandstorms, their cautious brushing of dust from artifacts, reminds us constantly of human fragility in the face of timeless forces. In the end, what lingers with me most is not simply the memory of action sequences or supernatural horrors, but the sense of having been transported. The settings are immersive enough that I can close my eyes and almost hear the whisper of wind through dunes, smell the must of ancient stone, feel the oppressive weight of heat on my skin. That transportive quality is what makes the story resonate on a deeper level. It's not just what happens to the characters that matters, but where it happens and how that place reshapes them. This, to me, is the true genius of the film's cinematic design. The realization that adventure is not only a matter of plot, but of atmosphere, that the world itself can be as compelling as any character. The desert, the tombs, the city, they are not just stages for human drama, but collaborators in it. Through cinematography, sound, lighting, and visual motifs, the filmmakers breathe life into stone and sand, turning them into storytellers in their own right. There's something enchanting about peeling back the polished surface of a film and glimpsing what really happened when the cameras weren't rolling. Every movie, no matter how smooth it looks on screen, hides its own collection of bruises, laughter, missteps, and serendipities. With this one, the behind-the-scenes journey feels almost as wild as the story it tells. If the finished film is a whirlwind of adventure, romance, and supernatural spectacle, the making of it was a chaotic dance between danger, creativity, and camaraderie. The set was not just a workplace. It was a crucible where friendships were forged, risks were taken, and accidents sometimes turned into blessings. Imagine first the scale of it. The filmmakers weren't working in the comfort of studio soundstages alone. They ventured into punishing environments, dragged heavy equipment across shifting sands, and staged elaborate stunts in places where even standing still could be exhausting. The desert locations were breathtaking, but they were merciless too. Temperatures soared so high that cast and crew would find their skin blistering and lips cracking before midday. There's a story about how water became as valuable as gold. Every day, trucks had to bring in gallons upon gallons, not just for drinking, but for keeping cameras and machinery from overheating. More than once, a piece of equipment simply shut down mid-shoot, unable to handle the sheer weight of the sun. And yet, instead of despair, there was often laughter. The absurdity of trying to tell a story about ancient curses while fighting off very real dehydration kept spirits alive. One of the most famous anecdotes concerns the lead actors pushing themselves far beyond what most stars today would ever attempt. Stunt doubles were, of course, present, but so much of the action ended up being performed by the main cast. Sword fights, chases, dangerous climbs, all filmed in relentless heat. One actor once joked in an interview that they weren't afraid of curses or undead armies. They were afraid of fainting on camera from exhaustion and having it preserved forever on film. The physicality of the shoot bonded everyone in ways more comfortable productions rarely achieve. They suffered together, and in that shared suffering, friendships grew deeper. Then there were the animals. Horses, camels, even insects. Each brought their own challenges. Camels, in particular, became notorious among the cast for their stubbornness. Scenes that look effortless on screen, with characters gracefully riding across dunes, often took hours to film because the animals refused to cooperate. At one point, an actor confessed that while their co-stars were frightening in makeup and special effects, nothing unnerved them more than trying to mount a camel without being thrown off. Horses, meanwhile, proved more reliable, though there were still a few near misses when charges or chases got too close to real danger. In one case, a horse reared unexpectedly, sending its rider tumbling into the sand. The crew rushed forward in panic, but the rider stood up laughing, brushing sand off and insisting they keep filming because it looked authentic. That scene, half accident, half performance, made it into the final cut. The insects, however, were another matter entirely. The film's story required swarms of scarabs, those beetles of nightmare legend, to scuttle across walls, floors, and sometimes even people. Of course, most of these were created with visual effects, but for close-ups, the filmmakers used real beetles. Thousands of them. They had to be carefully wrangled, chilled beforehand to slow their movements, and then placed strategically so that when they warmed up under the lights, they began to scurry. Imagine being an actor lying on the floor, knowing that in a few seconds, dozens of live beetles would crawl across your skin. One actress, usually the picture of composure, admitted that it was the single most difficult part of the shoot. Not running, not stunts, not memorizing lines, just staying absolutely still while the beetles tickled her arms. To this day, she laughs about it, but at the time, her screams between takes were legendary. There were also surreal moments where reality seemed to echo fiction. During a desert shoot, a sudden sandstorm swept across the set, blotting out visibility and forcing everyone to scramble for cover. The storm was so violent that tents collapsed, lights toppled, and makeup was literally scoured off faces. For hours afterward, everyone moved around looking like sand-sculpted versions of themselves. The eerie part? They had just been filming a scene about a supernatural sandstorm moments before. The cast joked nervously about whether they had accidentally angered something ancient. The footage captured before the storm hit was so dramatic that the director later admitted it felt as though nature itself had decided to join the cast. What's remarkable is how often mistakes and setbacks turned into triumphs. One of the most iconic visual sequences almost never happened because the planned special effect wouldn't work in real time. Computers in the late 1990s were powerful but limited compared to today, and the visual effects team was constantly pushing technology to its limits. They improvised endlessly, layering practical effects with digital enhancements. Smoke machines, sand blowers, miniature models, all combined with computer-generated imagery. In one case, what was supposed to be a seamless CGI shot had to be spliced together with 3 separate attempts, stitched invisibly in editing. Watching it now, you'd never know. The smooth terror on screen hides the sweat of dozens of technicians experimenting with every trick they knew. And then there's the human side of the production, the way the cast and crew interacted when the cameras weren't rolling. The desert can be lonely, so evenings were often filled with communal meals, laughter, and games. Someone would bring out a guitar, others would swap ghost stories, and sometimes even the most exhausted crew members found themselves staying up late just to prolong the camaraderie. There's a story about how one actor began a running prank war with the makeup department, hiding prosthetic pieces in people's bags or sneaking sand into shoes. By the end of the shoot, the entire crew was involved, with even the director occasionally caught off guard. These small, human moments offset the harshness of the environment. But not every challenge was light-hearted. There were real dangers too. In one harrowing incident, an actor performing a hanging scene passed out for real due to a mishap with the safety rig. The crew realized only when they saw the limpness in his body and rushed to cut him down. Thankfully, he recovered quickly, but the memory shook everyone. Filmmaking often dances on the edge between illusion and reality, and here, that line blurred dangerously. From that day on, extra precautions were taken, and the actor himself later joked grimly that he had gone method without meaning to. Medical emergencies weren't uncommon. Heat stroke, dehydration, and exhaustion sent several crew members to medical tents over the course of the production. Local doctors were on standby, and sometimes even they looked overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the endeavor. And yet, morale remained astonishingly high. Perhaps because they all knew they were part of something bigger than themselves, something ambitious, risky, and exhilarating. Every time exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them, someone would crack a joke, or a director would remind them of how amazing it was all going to look on screen. That belief carried them through. The chemistry between the leads deserves its own note, because it didn't just happen, it was cultivated. On screen, their banter feels natural, effortless. Off-screen, they worked hard at building that rapport, rehearsing scenes together, sharing meals, and often improvising dialogue in rehearsals until it felt real. More than once, a line that makes audiences laugh today was born in an offhand quip between takes, caught by the director, and written into the script on the spot. The willingness to play, to experiment, gave the film a spark of spontaneity rare in big-budget productions. Directors and cinematographers often describe filmmaking as organized chaos, and this project embodied that. Cameras jammed in the middle of crucial takes, props broke, sets collapsed under their own weight. Once, a carefully constructed temple wall toppled during a rehearsal, forcing the art department to rebuild in a matter of days. They did so with remarkable speed, and when the scene was finally shot, the wall looked sturdier than ever. An accident turned into an improvement. What touches me most in remembering these behind-the-scenes stories is how human they are. When we watch the finished film, we see magic, but behind that magic are people, sweating, laughing, panicking, improvising. The The friendships forged in that crucible lasted long after production wrapped. Actors still speak fondly of the experience, not just because of the film's success, but because of the bonds created in the desert, under the blazing sun and starry skies. In the end, the behind-the-scenes journey is as much a story of survival as the film itself. Survival of heat, of exhaustion, of unforeseen accidents and technological limitations. But also survival of joy, finding ways to laugh when everything went wrong, finding connection in the middle of nowhere, finding creativity where resources fell short. The cast and crew came out of it not just with a finished movie, but with memories of shared resilience, the kind that linger long after applause fades. Themes have a way of sneaking into a film, don't they? You sit down expecting an adventure, maybe some laughs, maybe a bit of romance, and then, almost without realizing it, you've been handed something heavier, something richer, like the story has given you a mirror and whispered, "Look closer." That's the beauty of cinema that endures. It entertains, but it also stirs something beneath the surface. This film, dressed up in dust and spectacle and humor, does exactly that. At first glance, it's an action-packed ride through the supernatural, but if you peel back its layers, you'll find a world pulsing with themes of mortality, love, memory, and the dangerous hunger for power. The symbols woven throughout are like ancient hieroglyphs, some obvious, some subtle, yet each one deepens the resonance of the tale. The most immediate and unshakable theme is mortality. Death hangs over everything, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively. From the opening frames, we are confronted with rituals of burial, curses designed to preserve and punish, and tombs meant to freeze time. Death here isn't quiet. It's loud, dangerous, and ever-present. Characters who chase immortality inevitably court destruction. One of the film's central figures embodies this tension perfectly. Punished for crimes of passion, denied peace, and cursed to live as a nightmare if ever disturbed. He represents not just death, but the perversion of it, the horror of being unable to rest. Watching him, one can't help but feel that lingering question. Is immortality worth the price? The film seems to insist that it is not. Every attempt to cheat death ends in ruin. Mortality, then, becomes not just a theme but a moral compass. To live fully, one must also accept the inevitability of an end. Alongside mortality is memory. The desert setting amplifies this. It is a place where time seems frozen, where sand swallows civilizations, and yet preserves fragments of them. The story is driven by memory in multiple ways. The memory of ancient love, the memory of betrayal, the memory of a culture buried yet refusing to vanish. Even the protagonists, in their own ways, are defined by what they remember and what they long to forget. The librarian heroine, for example, lives in the shadow of a cultural memory. Books, scrolls, and relics she reveres not as dead artifacts, but as living pieces of the past. The adventurer she partners with, meanwhile, tries to bury his own past in recklessness and bravado, but memory clings to him like desert dust. Together, their journey is not just about survival, but about reconciling with the power of the past, learning from it without being consumed by it. Love, of course, beats at the heart of the tale. Not the shallow, decorative kind, but love as an all-consuming force capable of creation and destruction. The ancient love affair that sparks the curse is painted with intensity, so fierce it defies law, morality, and even death itself. It is both tragic and terrifying, a reminder that love without boundaries can twist into obsession. Yet in contrast, the burgeoning romance between the two modern leads offers a different vision, one grounded in partnership, growth, and mutual respect. They bicker, they stumble, but they also learn from each other, proving that love need not consume to be powerful. The juxtaposition of these two relationships, one ancient and doomed, the other fresh and hopeful, creates a thematic balance. Love, the story suggests, is only redemptive when it allows freedom, when it is tempered by respect. Then there's the hunger for power, a theme as old as the pyramids themselves. Greed drives much of the chaos. Treasure hunters risk everything for gold. Scholars pry open tombs in pursuit of knowledge, and villains seek dominion over life and death. The cursed figure at the center of it all is not merely a monster, but a symbol of unchecked ambition. His resurrection comes not just from ritual, but from human arrogance. Those who ignored warnings, who thought themselves above consequence. In this way, the film critiques more than its characters. It critiques a broader cultural impulse, the way modernity often plunders the past without reverence. Every shimmering artifact, every golden relic, becomes not just treasure but temptation, daring the characters to prove whether they value wisdom over wealth, life over control. Symbolism saturates the film like desert heat. Take the desert itself, vast, relentless, indifferent. It symbolizes both eternity and erasure. It preserves bodies and ruins alike, but it also erases tracks, swallows armies, and humbles pride. To walk in the desert is to be reminded of insignificance, of how small human ambition looks against endless sands. Within the desert lie tombs, themselves symbols of human attempts to control mortality. Structures built to cheat time, filled with curses to frighten away intruders. The tomb is both sanctuary and snare, a physical embodiment of the film's themes. The past preserved, but at great peril. The scarabs, too, are more than creepy crawlies. They symbolize the relentlessness of nature, devouring everything in their path, unstoppable as time itself. Watching them swarm, one sees more than insects. One sees decay, inevitability, the truth that all flesh, no matter how mighty, is subject to being broken down. In contrast, the Book of the Dead and the Book of the Living represent humanity's constant tug-of-war between destruction and salvation, between invoking death and granting life. These objects, treated with reverence by some and carelessness by others, symbolize knowledge itself. Powerful, dangerous, and transformative depending on the hands that wield it. Even smaller visual cues hum with symbolic resonance. The contrast between light and shadow, used repeatedly in the cinematography, reinforces the thin boundary between good and evil, between life and death. Torches flickering in the dark remind us of knowledge as a fragile flame in the face of overwhelming ignorance. The endless sandstorms mirror the chaos unleashed by hubris, beautiful from afar, devastating up close. And water, though less present, emerges as salvation, an oasis, a reprieve, the opposite of the suffocating desert. When characters encounter water, it is almost always tied to moments of renewal or relief, underscoring its symbolic role as life itself. These themes and symbols aren't scattered randomly. They weave tightly into the plot and characters. The cursed antagonist, with his insatiable thirst for resurrection and revenge, embodies mortality twisted by denial. His very existence symbolizes what happens when memory becomes obsession and love becomes possession. The protagonists, in contrast, represent acceptance. They learn, they grow, they stumble, but they move forward rather than clinging backward. Their journey is not just physical, but philosophical, a progression from arrogance to humility, from greed to gratitude. Even supporting characters are touched by these ideas. The cowardly treasure hunters, obsessed with riches, meet grisly ends, each death a moral lesson on the cost of greed. The loyal brother, with his humor and charm, represents the value of family and companionship in the face of terror. The enigmatic protectors of the tomb embody respect for tradition and the weight of cultural memory, their solemn duty a reminder that some knowledge should remain guarded. Through each of them, the themes ripple outward, reminding us that this isn't just a story about monsters, but about human choices, human flaws, human longing. What strikes me most, though, is how the film holds a mirror up to the audience. Haven't we all, in some way, been tempted by immortality? Not literally, but in our desire to leave a mark, to be remembered, to cling to youth? Haven't we all wrestled with memory, with whether to let go or hold on? The desert, the tombs, the curses, these are grand theatrical symbols, but they point back to deeply human truths. Watching the characters stumble through these trials feels like watching ourselves, dramatized in ancient stone and blowing sand. And isn't that what makes stories like this endure? They entertain, yes, but they also whisper truths about love's dangers, memory's weight, mortality's certainty, and ambition's cost. The symbols, from scarabs to storms, from torches to tombs, aren't just set dressing. They are reminders that every adventure is also a parable, every spectacle also a sermon. We may laugh, we may gasp, but when the credits roll, something lingers. A reminder that sand always slips through fingers, that some doors should remain closed, and that love, when chosen wisely, can outlast curses. That is the brilliance of it all. The way spectacle and symbolism entwine, making a film that feels larger than life but resonates with the most ordinary truths. It dazzles us with ancient ruins and undead horrors, but in its heart, it tells us about ourselves, our fears, our hopes, our longing to be remembered, and our need to let go. And that perhaps is the most enduring magic it offers. Not the curse, not the treasure, but the mirror.